human resources, human capital, people, and culture. This single vocation has many names. HR professionals are responsible for what is arguably the most critical success factor within any organization. It's talent. HR Studio Podcast brings you interviews from HR and industry thought leaders so you can listen, learn, and leverage. Welcome to HR Studio Podcast, building the next generation of HR leaders. HR Studio is brought to you by A.J. O'Connor Associates. To learn more about our sponsor, please visit ajoconnor.com and be sure to check out the AJO blog for additional HR learning tools and resources.
Welcome to HR Studio. This is your host, Kyle O'Connor. I'm very excited to have our guest from episode 1 back, Seth Mattison. If you haven't listened in, please go back and check it out. You'll notice a huge progression from Seth and ourselves here at HR Studio and our journey. But to give you a background, if you haven't heard from Seth before, Seth is an internationally renowned expert and author of The Future of Work and Leadership. As founder and chief movement officer of Luminate Labs, Seth advises many of the world's leading brands and organizations on the key shifts happening around talent management, change and innovation, leadership, and the future of work. He's touched just about every industry and has worked with brands ranging from IBM and Microsoft to GE and Chevron. Seth, thanks for coming back, and I miss talking to you. It's going to be fun.
Likewise, Kyle. Thanks for the invitation to come back. I can't believe it's kind of interesting that I got to be a part of your very first kickoff podcast and to see your transformation and journey through this medium, and the stories that you've been telling is pretty remarkable. So thanks for the opportunity to come back.
Thanks. And the catalyst for you, we would have had you back regardless, but really you talk about transformation. You have this book that just came out. Congratulations.
Thank you.
The War at Work. I recommend everyone to go out and get a copy of this. So let me just tell you a little bit about myself. When you sent this to me, you sent me a PDF version of it, and it's like, let me check this out. I'll start reading it, get an idea what it's about. And it was like 10 o'clock at night, East Coast time, and I got probably about 100 pages in. I look up at the clock, and it was like 1 o'clock, and I was like,
wow.
I should probably go to bed. But it's a really good book. It's the story carries very quickly through it, and the lessons in it are just really impactful. So I think people are going to get a lot out of it.
That is awesome feedback. That's hearing people's story and reaction to the way we wrote this. So this is a leadership, future of work book told within the parameters of a parable. It's a business parable, and we intentionally, my co-author and myself, forced ourselves to try to write a really compelling story that could talk about the transformation and the journey that leaders have been navigating over the past, 2 to 3 decades. This book, our main characters are essentially, I see them as being in their mid to late 40s.
Okay.
And we wrote those characters, they essentially start their career in the early 90s. They're essentially Gen Xers, and we picked them as our main character because we see them as the catalyst for helping all of us move through this transformational period of time. And on top of that, quite frankly, I feel like, not to get too much on the generational topic, but I feel like Xers get so left out of conversations today.
Yes.
It's crazy. I just came back from 3 or 4 events for industries talking about the future of the industry. And the whole conversation was around boomers and millennials, which has been true for the last 10 years. And I'm saying to the room, and I'm saying to these leaders of the industry, guys, millennials, you and I are not the next C-suite drivers of change and transformation in most organizations. It's the Xers.
Right.
Of course, millennials are stepping into key leadership roles, certainly, leading edge members being 35 and 36. But outside of the tech space, in most traditional industries, it's going to be Gen X. And so, and not that other generations won't get value out of this, but picking characters who, in my mind, were roughly 47, 48, started their career in the early 90s, we forced ourselves to write a compelling story. Number one. And number two, we forced ourselves, as you will see, and the ego screams to write more. The ego says it needs to be thicker. It needs to have bulk, right? It needs to look like it's this scientific, deep thought exploration. And the problem with that is nobody reads that.
Yep.
Nobody reads it.
You're right.
And so we were in this journey of like, do we want to try to look smart, or do we want to try to write something that actually gets read and moves people? And so we set a goal to bring this thing in under 150 pages. And that alone there was so much more to talk about, and there was more to the story that we would have written. But it was like, I want people to pick this up. And it's funny because we all do it too. It's this little voice in the back of your head. You pick it up and you say to yourself, oh, I could read that.
Yeah. Yep.
Right. And it's like, it's so subtle, but you're like, oh, I could probably knock this out on a flight.
Right.
And that's where we wanted it to go. So the fact that you just kicked off with the story of like, you sat down at that time of night and felt you got caught up in the story enough to like look up and it's 1:00. Does that happen to most of us when we read most business books? And I'll let your listeners and viewers decide for themselves.
Absolutely
whether or
not.
not that's true.
I have a stack that are collecting dust, just because you get through that first surge and then that's it.
Same.
No, it's cool. So walk me through, if you don't mind, the creative process of you. So I think it might be even harder to write like a shorter book like that, because you have to be very intentional about what you put in, what you're going to take out. How much of this book is like true from working with clients and stories that you've heard out there? And walk me through how you came up with the idea for this.
Great question. So one of the advantages that I've had in writing this book at this stage in my career, it's like I've been speaking and doing the research for almost a decade now. I went and partnered with 2 best-selling authors, got to help support them in the writing of a book back in 2009 called The M Factor, all about millennials. And as I transitioned my research into, instead of looking exclusively at generations, looking at larger trends, and working with clients, we do about 75 to 80 live speaking events a year, some of which are, an hour keynote type setting, and some of them are a half day or a full day kind of deep dive workshop with leaders. What was happening is over the last 4 years, this was essentially a 4-year research project, is while I was working with clients, I was essentially getting to do reconnaissance and research and test theories, ideas, and strategies with my clients in the moment and get real-time feedback. Right. So I would ask questions and share a case study or story, some of which have shown up in this, and I'd get audience reaction. Did it connect with people? Did people hear me tell a story that then shows up in this about what it was like, coming of age in more of a hierarchical top-down world of work? And did they look at me like they were confused, or were they like, yes, that was my life? And every time that happened, I would make a note, and it was like, okay, that's a theory, that's a concept, that's a story that connected. People felt that at a visceral level. And so over 4 years, testing, getting feedback, collecting people's stories that we're willing to share. Again, because if you think about the 2 main characters starting their careers in the early 90s, I didn't come out of university until 2005. Some of this was about, doing the interviews and the research of what are essentially kind of that next wave of C-suite leaders. What was their life like starting out at that time? What was technology like? How did they build relationships? And by doing that, it informed and started to help kind of craft who these characters would become. And so while this isn't based on 2 real people, the profiles are very representative and symbolic of someone who is, getting ready to take over organizations and step up into those next leadership roles, certainly.
Excellent. Yeah. No, you could tell that I felt like people I worked with before, so it was like, oh, this is really accurate. So the things in there.
Good.
Yeah.
I'm so glad. And also, hopefully, in terms of like, it's not written in such a way or so historic or so far back that, I'm 35, leading edge member of millennials, that millennials won't get value from this, or younger workers won't get value as well, because not only will they hopefully get a little perspective on who they're working for, I think some of it will be things that are universally relatable that they can apply in their own leadership practices.
Excellent. Yeah, and that's kind of segues into the next question I was going to ask. So you said really Gen Xers. This is kind of the center point of this book. What about like baby boomers and millennials? What do you think about the people that are like heading out to their career
Sure.
on their way out? Because I see
Sure.
some value in that, definitely.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, while, again, the characters were kind of represented that Gen X category, every baby boomer that has read this, and I actually worked with and partnered with a few boomers to help guide the story, to be respectful of, because again, I think just to set the stage of, like, when we say the war at work, what are we talking about? Essentially, we're talking about this dynamic tension between two worlds, the world of the hierarchy and the world of the network. What do I mean by that? Right? Our belief is that we're entering this era that's going to become, we'll look back on it and call it the age of the networks. Right? All around us, we're living in a world, a society based on networks of information, of context, of resources, knowledge, and entertainment. That's becoming our world. And the challenge for most leaders, anyone who's been working for about 15 years or more, is that we have been operating in a world where the structures and, more importantly, the deeply embedded culture of the hierarchy has been our reality. Right. And these, having been birthed into that world, shapes how we see the world. So it was really interesting. 2 months ago, I got to speak alongside the famed MIT author and professor Peter Senge. And Peter writes about systems thinking and organizational theory and change. And Peter said something before I spoke. He went and then I went. He said organizational structures are mirrored in our assessments, thinking, and mental models. They form the basis for our reality. And when he said that, it just like, I was like, I literally jumped up in the air of like, yes! Partly it's like, now that an MIT, famed author is saying it, it's validating our theory. But essentially what he was saying is, coming of age in a hierarchical structure, it shapes the way you think about talent and communication and career paths and all of that. And so I went up to Peter afterwards and I said, I completely agree with everything that you said. The only thing I would tweak, which is interesting to roll up to an MIT professor and tell him that you think it's slightly wrong, right? We're just like a dude from Minnesota, but he was very gracious. And essentially it was, I said, instead of saying organizational structure, I would simply swap that with societal structures, because in our research we found, and he agreed, the hierarchy runs way deeper than just inside our organizations. Right?
Absolutely.
The hierarchy shows up in our family dynamics from birth, right? Patriarchal family structures. It's in our government structures, our higher education institutions, our religious institutions. Hierarchy is everywhere. And so this book is essentially this collision between hierarchical world, hierarchies, and this new emerging world of the network. And as more and more of our marketplaces become networked, as more and more of our talent has been coming of age birthed in networks, this collision becomes more apparent. So our quest was basically to say, how do leaders lead through this change now? If all you've ever known, even if it's operating at a subconscious level, is a hierarchical form of communication and leadership and what it means to be a leader, how do we start to let go of, I labeled them as these unwritten rules of navigating the hierarchy. And that goes back to your question of where did the stories come from? I would ask audiences, what's one unwritten rule that you learned early on about navigating the hierarchy? And Kyle, the stories that people would share with us were unbelievable. And everyone has them. And so that was part of the collecting process of like, this is a real thing. So to your question about baby boomers and millennials, what value, what would they take away from this, is that this will be very relatable for boomers as well. Any boomer who's got, they're thinking, I've got, maybe 5, maybe 10 years left in my career and I want to make a mark. They will completely relate to the journey that these two characters have gone through, of like all of the unwritten rules that they had to learn how to adapt to. And then thinking about, what might I be willing to let go of? Who might I need to become to lead in this more new networked world. So boomers for sure. And for millennials, I think it will be an interesting exploration of, number one, getting some perspective on why the leaders they work for are the way they are, number one. Number two, for millennials that are more our age, where we've been working now, if we've got a decade, I find that the longer you operate in this structure, the more you start to kind of adopt and learn how to survive in it. So when I talk to millennials that are 35, it's like they've started to figure out some of these rules. They've figured out, how do you survive in this dynamic? And so it's not that far of a stretch for them to think, okay, before I stay in this too long, who might we need to become as leaders in this new world? So I think both, while Gen X is kind of the target and the main characters, both boomers and millennials will get a ton of value out of it.
Excellent. So you brought up something that was very, that was kind of a question I was going to bring up next, but give us like one or two takeaways or action items that people could do to implement. And you said the exact question, which I was going to ask: how do leaders lead through this change, and what would you recommend they do to take action to be effective in this new world?
So it's great question. And everybody, that was a big journey of this too, of when we first kind of recognized this thing was happening, this tension between these two worlds. At first, it was just an awareness factor. And that really is step one. Like step one, because what we are is it's like the old saying, fish in water. The fish is unaware of that it's swimming in water. It doesn't know, right, that it's water. And that's very much how it is for most leaders. It's helping them kind of, number one, recognize like, wow, coming of age in these structures is shaping how I see my business, how I see the marketplace, how I see talent. I hadn't thought about that before. So we're trying to make them aware of the water, number one. Then give them some perspective as to what are some of the new operating principles of this network. How is the network acting and responding? And we try to do that in a really non-deep theoretical way, but just some practical things. And then it becomes, okay, how do I show up? And what I find is like most people think it's going to be this really complex, difficult to comprehend model in order to evolve. And the truth is, it comes down to a couple of really simple things. In fact, they're so simple that people often kind of look back and they're like, no, it can't be that simple. It has to be more complex, because we want it to be complex. You cannot change organizational structures and how your business operates without first making an internal shift. And that's the biggest thing. So you've got, and I know a big part of your audience are HR practitioners and HR leaders. If you're listening to this and you're watching, I want you to be thinking about how this plays out inside the HR function, but I also want you to be thinking about how do you show up and support the leaders that you're helping, right? And you're guiding, you're a business, support structure for. How do you help them make this transformation? So we actually found in the model to bridge the gap between hierarchies and networks, it really boiled down to 4 pillars. It was addressing mindset, culture, process, and technology. Right? Mindset, culture, process, technology. Those 4 kind of key levers are what every organization has to address. Now, Kyle, what most people do is they jump to technology and process, right, to try to embrace this network world. We try to jam in a social collaboration platform. We put some new processes in place to let people work more fluid and flexibly. And then we wonder why it didn't create transformational change for the organization. And the reason it doesn't is because it has to start with mindset. It has to start internally first, leadership mindset. So within that category, there are 2 mind shifts that everyone has to be willing to make to embrace this new transformation. 2 new mind shifts. And the first is what we call the humble mind shift. Humble mind shift. Now you could be, okay, why that? Well, what we have found is that one of the trappings, one of the unwritten rules we learned in the world of the hierarchy, and this is very subtle, was this unwritten rule to never question authority. And every leader in every room around the world always knows and acknowledges and agrees this. Like, yes, of course. And it's like everyone has a story about remembering seeing someone who didn't follow that unwritten rule, right? They called out a higher up in a meeting, and then no one ever heard from that person again, right? Like that person just disappears, or their career gets sidetracked. Like it happens. It's a real thing. So what our explanation was, okay, if you spend 10, 20, 30 years coming of age in an environment where one of the unwritten rules is to never question authority, then the assumption gets made that a leader's job is to either be right? Because if we're not supposed to question them, it means they either have the answers, right? They know where we're going and what we're doing. A leader's job is to be right, or a leader's job is to essentially squash dissent. Those are the only two things that come out of it. And so what I would post to my leadership groups is, if you spend 20 or 30 years adopting that, then how do you not then when you become the leader, not slip into a space of believing, I have to have all of the answers. I have to have it all figured out, right? We learned, like, never let them see you sweat.
Right. Never
look like you're not prepared. The hardest statement, the hardest 3 words for any leader to say is, I don't know. That's what they've been trained. So how do you not embrace that? And what comes with that is ego follows you up that path, and all of the trappings, right? The corner office, the title, makes it more and more difficult. And what happens when you can't say, I don't know, when you can't admit that we don't have all of the answers, when that's the reality for most of us in our marketplaces today, it's impossible for leaders. Past success is no longer a guaranteed predictor of future results. No one has it all figured out. And so it requires leaders to first be able to say, despite coming of age in this, I have to operate from a place of, I don't have all of the answers. And I'm trying to take in as many inputs, and whether that input comes from the 25-year-old, right, on the manufacturing shop floor or out with customers, we break down that idea of leaders at the top have to have all of the answers. And in order to really do that, it takes a huge shift of humility.
Wow.
Right? It takes a huge internal shift of humility for all of us to say, I don't have it all figured out. And so leaders always want like this big complex thing to help them. And it's like, no, number one, you have to look in the mirror and be able to take a shift in humility. That's one. The second one is an abundant mindset. So the first one was the humble mind shift. The second one is the abundant mind shift. And I could be like, abundant, what do we mean by that? What we have found is that the world of the hierarchy is based on scarcity.
Okay.
It's based on a scarcity mindset. Because if you think about it, it's like, in that world, it's all about limited supply, limited resources, limited seats, right? If you want to move up in that world, you have to compete.
Right.
There's only one slot at the top of that world. And you start to talk about it, most people, again, the larger the organization, and every culture is a little bit different, but it's like, it's all about competing. And we actually get taught that, and we get trained for that all through school, right? It's like you got to compete to get into the good school. There's only a limited number of slots in the right school. And then you got to compete to get to the highest part of the class so that you can get the best jobs. So it's like you're constantly being taught this mindset of, in order for me to succeed, someone else has to fail.
Right.
In order for me to get up. And so what comes out of that? I had a leader come up to me after a session recently, and she said, Seth, I learned 2 rules for competing in that world, 2 rules to get ahead. Rule number 1, don't tell anyone what you know.
Right. I remember we talked about this before.
Yeah,
hoarding information.
Hoarding information, hoarding resources. Everyone goes into protection mode. And that is so characteristic of what can happen in hierarchical environments at all levels of society. And so in order to embrace the network is about expansion and unprecedented abundance. It's a mindset of saying there is more than enough to go around. My success is not dependent upon you losing. Right. We can create more value and more resources so that we can all raise up. That mindset, though, has to come from the top, right? To create a cultural shift like that, it requires leaders operating from that space first. So you say, well, how do you start to create an abundant mindset in your culture, behaviors around that? The fastest way to recognize and build abundance is to bring gratitude into your life and into the life of the organization. So how do you make that practical, the idea of gratitude? focusing on abundance and more. One of the easiest things, first you have to do it yourself, right? So I always work with people of if you can operate at that place, gratitude in your own life, every single morning, first 5 minutes of every morning, how do I start my day? Focus on what am I most grateful for? What are the 3 things, right? In fact, I've got a great little resource if people don't already have it called the 5-Minute Journal.
Okay.
Don't have this, get this. It's one of my favorite little books. It's called the 5-Minute Journal because it literally takes 5 minutes. Start in the morning, 3 things you're grateful for, 3 things that it's going to make it a great day, setting the intention for the day. And at the end of the night, 3 reflections, 3 great things that happened. What it does is it helps you focus on what you have. Right?
I like that. That's good.
It's good, right? So you start with yourself, and then to bring it into the culture, first 5 minutes of every meeting, and I've had leaders implement this and send me notes. Most meetings, we start the meetings off talking about problems. And we want to flip that. First 5 minutes, have your people in any team focus on what they're grateful for, not in their life, but in the business.
Wow. Okay, that's
Something
great.
magical happens, right? It's like you have to talk about what are you grateful for in the business. Is it gets people to think about the things and the resources that they do have instead of all of the things that they don't have. And that small shift, it just starts to permeate in a team. And I've seen the results. And when people start operating from that position, they start to move out of that mindset of in order for me to succeed, you have to fail and I have to hoard. And people start operating from a position of generosity and abundance, and it permeates the organization. Humility and abundance. It is the first 2 mind shifts to get people into embracing this new networked world. We don't have to overcomplicate it. Those are not easy things to do, but everyone is capable of it. That's where we start.
Wow, that's really good. Yeah, it's so true because there's so many people out there now. I think of the founders of even other spaces of business like Tony Robbins.
Yep.
Those type of guys, they always talk about the human brain is really trained to survive and not thrive. And we're really fortunate. We live in a time where there's a lot of crazy things happening, but there's also a lot of abundance, and people forget about that. So all this alarmism really shouldn't be going off. It should be, what do we have? And we both live in the United States. We have such abundance here.
Totally.
So we have to train ourselves, and it really starts the leadership and working its way throughout the organization. So kudos to you for doing that. That's really good.
Thank you. And I will just add to that, and then we can jump off of it.
Sure.
Is just it is a mindset, and it's not about how much you really have in front of you, because some of your listeners might be thinking, well, that's cool, Seth, but you know what? I'm operating in an industry and a business where things are kind of bleak around here, and we don't have an abundance of resources. And what I have people do a little exercise. I'll ask a room, I'll say, I want you to write down on a piece of paper, I want you to write down the word not enough, the phrase not enough. And I want you to draw a line. And next to that, I want you to write the phrase more than enough. So not enough and more than enough. And I'll say, and your listeners, I want you to think about this. It's like, how many of you know people who have very little financially, but live an abundant life? They have more than enough, even though they have very little financially, materialistically. Everyone raises their hand. And I say, how many of you know people who have unbelievable wealth, right? So much from a materialistic standpoint, and they constantly operate from a position of not enough.
Right.
Everyone raises their hand. So what we've just proven is that it is a mindset. It is a belief. It is not about how much is actually in front of you. So I don't care if you're operating in an industry or a company where things are tight and things are difficult. It is still, to your point about Tony, it starts here.
It does.
And that influences how we show up. So.
That's awesome. I love it. I love how you're incorporating this in the organizations. I think it's really important, and there's science behind it now too, which is going to just further validate the ROI of it. So
yes,
it's good stuff. So before we wrap up today, I want to see what's next for you. You just did a whole years and years of research for this. I mean, what springboards you next? What's on the horizon for you?
Great question. So part of it is taking this book and creating more tools and assets for people to implement the ideas that are in here, right? Okay. More tangible tools. So we're working on that, video assets, e-learning, et cetera. Another massive project that we're getting ready to roll out is this Luminate community, which is going to live at justluminate.com. Okay. And essentially what it is we targeted it at basically the next generation of leaders. And by next gen leaders, I don't mean millennials. I just mean people who are, as boomers kind of retire, who's taking over. And this community is essentially a place to come and be inspired. And we're going to focus on bringing content around a couple key areas. We're talking about shining a light on the way we work, lead, live, and love. And not only will I be publishing content in this community, but we have curated 50 thought leaders, 50 writers who are contributing and bringing insight. And we just want to serve it as a place. There's lots of platforms out there for entrepreneurs, but I feel like there's not a lot of great resources and tools for people who are in the trenches,
right,
in that 30 to 45, 30 to 50 range, where you can tap into and find resources and really rich, vibrant, interesting media across all channels. So to access us, to access interesting content and other thought leaders, it's going to live at justluminate.com. That's been a massive year-long project. And it's going to come live towards the end of this summer. So I'll send you a note, and we can give a buzz to everybody in your community.
Absolutely.
To come and join on that front. And so that's a big project. And then the other thing I'm doing is, honestly, I am spending time through meditation and retreats and just journaling and writing to kind of identify what's the next thing that we're being called to write about. This was an observation of what was happening in the marketplace, and then thinking and researching it for 4 years. We're going to identify we'll still keep talking about this, but I'm going through the self-exploration of what will be the next kind of big thing. And once we identify that and test and see, like, this is going to be a way to add value to people's lives, you will be the first to know, and we'll come back and we'll talk about that part of it.
Excellent. I can't wait. It's really exciting. Seth, thanks for being on our show today. This is really awesome. I think this book has done a lot for me personally. I recommend everybody in our community to go out and get a copy of it. It's such an easy read, and you're going to get a lot out of it. Last thing, Seth, Amazon, where should we find
Amazon?
This?
Yeah, easy to find on Amazon. And the biggest thing that your community can do and help and support, we set a goal. With Amazon, one of the biggest things that really helps books catch fire are reviews. And in the beginning, we set a goal of 200 5-star reviews when this thing came out, which would be unbelievable. And man, we've come out of the gate smoking. I think we're already at 50 or maybe even 55 5-star reviews.
Awesome. Okay.
Which is huge. And so it catches momentum. So what I would say to everyone is, if you love this book, and I hope you do, the best thing that you could do is pass it on to someone else and go hit 5 stars on Amazon. It creates this unbelievable momentum. That's the greatest thing anyone could do for me. And we poured a lot into this. So I hope you love it as much as we do. And I'm so grateful that you read it. I'm so grateful for the opportunity to come back and share the message, Kyle. I love what you're doing, and anything that we can do to support you and your community on that mission, or anything we can do, we're here for you, man.
You're the man. You're going to get 5 stars this afternoon from me. I'm going to go on there next right after this, so I'll take care of that for you.
Thanks, Kyle. I appreciate you, and I appreciate everybody that was listening in. Can't wait to connect.
All right. Thanks a lot, Seth.
Take care, gang.
Thank you for listening to HR Studio Podcast, building the next generation of HR leaders. To download the show notes and discover additional information from this week's episode, please visit hrstudiopodcast.com. To join the conversation, we invite you to visit our LinkedIn group, where you will connect with a growing community of current and future HR leaders.